Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak today. I'm very excited to talk with you about genetic engineering. So before I get too far into the science and all the details, I'd like to give you a little bit more background about myself. So I'm here today representing Biology Fortified. It's a nonprofit organization that I helped to found. We're mostly funded by individual donations. We don't take money from corporations or things like that, so we're completely independent. And the goal of our organization is to foster public discussion of plant genetics and genetic engineering. And Frank in Food, which you can see here, this is our blog mascot. He was invented by my co-founder, Carl Haro von Mogel. And we actually recently funded a Kickstarter to produce Franken Foods and Lanakila Papaya also. So if you're interested in getting your hands on one of these, you can come talk to me afterwards. But what's really exciting about Frank is that he's a tool that helps us to teach people about agriculture and food. So he's been all over the world and helped, with different kinds of farming and things like that. So if you'd like to learn more about Frank or other activities, then I encourage you to visit biofortified.org. So this is more about me. We already covered most of that. But I did just want to point out my disclaimer really quick. I do, my current day job is I do science policy for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but I am not representing the Department of Agriculture here today. I'm representing my nonprofit. So I want to talk just really quickly. I'm not just a PhD. there's more behind that title. Ever since I was little, I've really cared a lot about the environment. I wanted to, I went through a phase where I wanted to be a marine biologist. I grew up in Florida. Everybody wants to be a marine biologist in Florida. And I really became interested in the idea of, making sure that everybody in the world has enough food to eat. Especially when I was in the military, I became acutely aware of the fact that I think a lot of the war and distrust between countries and issues that we have on the planet are actually due to there not being enough food in the world and it not being equally distributed. So I became really interested in these issues and started studying that through my science. But then I became a mom. So my daughter, thankfully, went to sleep in her stroller back there. She's 11 months old, and I'm sure most of your parents or grandparents, having a child really changes the way that you feel about the world. So I started out, really caring about environmentalism and making sure that things are safe and things like that. And now it's even stronger. And so I'm taking my scientific background and using that to help me figure out what's safe for my daughter and for the world, for my daughter's children, hopefully, and things like that. So let's get into the science. So in my research, I found that there's a lot of contradictions out there. We see, out in the media or blogs and different things are telling us we need to eat more natural foods. Natural is good. And we're seeing genetic engineering isn't natural. But as I'll show you in my talk, what's really interesting is that most food isn't natural at all. We've done a lot to manipulate it, even way before genetic engineering came along. And what I think is really cool is that genetic engineering is based on natural processes. So can anybody tell me what these are? Just shout it out if anybody has a guess. I think I heard carrots. Yep, that's the ancestor of carrots. Good, any guesses on this next one? No? It's lettuce, the ancestor of lettuce. And this next one I think is really funny looking. It's these ugly berries with these spikes on them. I guess somebody said eggplant. It's actually a relative of eggplant. That's tomatoes. And this last one here, I bet some people know this one. I heard cabbage. Yep, good. Yeah, that's cabbage. So as you can see, just in these common foods that we eat, we say, of course these are natural. It's tomatoes and carrots and lettuce. But they're actually completely different from what you'd find in nature. And there's very few things that we eat today that are actually in their natural state. But we actually had two of them today in our lovely hors d'oeuvre session, which is blueberries and salmon. Those have been not altered too much by humans. So if you want to go really natural, those are two foods you can go with. So to elaborate a little bit on the cabbage one, so this is the ancestral plant here, this wild mustard plant. And through many years of breeding, hundreds of years of breeding, humans have turned this spindly little unedible plant into all of these delicious vegetables, and many more than these. I'm sure that our chef could tell us all of the other vegetables that are related to these. And isn't that amazing that we took this one little weed and through breeding we turned it into all of these other delicious things? So I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on the process behind that. And so here I've got this column where I'm going to go through some different characteristics of different breeding methods. So first we'll talk about traditional breeding. Example foods are, like I said, just about everything that we eat. Sometimes there's crosses between species, and it happens in nature all the time. That's the process of evolution. Natural selection changes genes, and you end up with different types of plants and animals. There could be hundreds to tens of thousands of genes affected in the breeding process, and we don't know which ones are affected unless we do a lot of additional science to do sequencing and things like that. You can patent, you can get intellectual property protection on a plant that you've bred, and those plants are organic eligible, of course. So something that's a little bit more removed from nature is interspecies crosses. And some examples that you may have eaten include pluots, tangelos, and wheat. Those are, by definition, between species. Sometimes it happens in nature, but it's not as common. And it could be tons and tons of genes affected. Again, we don't know which ones are being affected. It's patentable, and it's organic eligible. So a little bit more recently, starting in about the 1950s, we started doing mutation breeding, which is using either chemicals or radiation to induce breaks in the chromosomes, which causes rearrangements and different genetic changes. And sometimes that results in characteristics that we like. So some examples are certain varieties of rice, apples, and grapefruits. And it doesn't happen between species. It does happen in nature, though. In fact, the sun is a very powerful mutagen, and that's one of the main drivers of evolution, is that UV rays can cause breaks in DNA, and that's why, unfortunately, at least some of us, probably myself, because I got a lot of sunburns as a kid, will end up with skin cancer because of the mutagenizing effect of the sun. We don't know how many genes are affected or what's going on unless we do a lot of sequencing. They're potentially patentable and organic eligible. And then last, of course, we come to GMOs. Some example foods that you might eat today are corn, soybeans, and canola. And often you can move genes in between species, although not always. You can also do genetic engineering to change the way that genes are expressed within a species. It does actually happen in nature, and I'm going to go into that in detail in just a moment. We know exactly what genes are affected. It's usually one or a small handful. The results are patentable, and this is the one that's not organic eligible. So there's a perception, right, that genetic engineering is not as safe as these other methods. It's sort of cut off from everything else. It's seen as a totally different breeding method, even though it's far more predictable than these other methods. So I just thought that was a little strange. So I made this claim that genetic engineering is a natural process. So all of this is just happening, it's just due to the DNA. And so DNA is just like computer code. It just tells the cells what to do. So it's just a set of instructions. And there's crazy amounts of DNA. Just like you'd imagine, there's lines and lines of computer code that's telling a program what to do. Well, each of us has 10 billion miles of DNA in our bodies, about 6 feet in each of our cells if we strung it out all end to end. So there's a lot of DNA that's potentially being manipulated with any of these breeding methods. So can you guys see that? It's a little bit dark. But so this is a phylogenetic tree. And I'm bringing this up because a lot of people are concerned about moving genes between species. It sounds weird. It sounds kind of unnatural, right? But it's not really. And so what's important here is that the phylogenetic tree is showing that all of these different organisms, in fact, all all living organisms on this planet all stem from a common ancestor, right? So we're all related. We're related to the trees that are out there or the birds singing outside. So all of us, we all have genes in common. So when you say, hey, we're going to move a gene from, bacteria into plants, oh, that sounds kind of spooky, but really, we have a lot of genes in common just to start with. There's a lot of natural gene transfer that happens as well. So this is one of my favorite examples. I just think this is really cool. So out naturally in the environment, aphids, which I'm sure all of us have had problems with aphids on our tomato plants or whatever, they live in the environment with a type of fungus that has a gene for a carotenoid. And carotenoids are just a pigment that makes carrots and other vegetables yellow or orange. And so through natural processes, the aphids took up a gene for those carotenoids, and it turned them orange. And it gave those orange aphids an advantage because the ladybugs didn't want to eat them. The ladybugs prefer to eat the green ones. So this is it's just amazing, right? It's just one of hundreds of examples of natural genetic engineering. So I'm going to get a little bit deeper into this now. So one of the main ways that genes get moved around in the environment are these pieces of DNA called transposons. And it's kind of like a virus, but what it does is that it actually takes a piece of genetic material and sticks it in the genome. So this is a representation of a pigment gene that's not normally expressed in normal oranges. So, it's showing normal colored orange. But this transposon inserts in here, turns the gene on, and makes the pigment expressed, so now you end up with this red-orange. And in a totally different, it says independent insertion, a totally different variety of orange, it happened a different time. You get a different transposon insert in there, turn on the gene, and made a different type of red-orange. And that's just, again, one of many examples of natural genetic engineering. So this picture here, I know it looks really crazy, but it's actually pretty simple. So these 3 lines are a sequence of DNA from 3 different corn lines. I'm actually a corn geneticist. So each of these little pieces here, you can see they are the same in all 3 lines. But all of these triangles are actually showing transposons. So, this one has a ton here, so if you strung it out and actually showed, the length of all the transposons, this sequence would be like way longer than the other ones, for example. So this is all natural genetic diversity due to this natural movement of genes. So I just got one more example. I'm going to go through this pretty fast because I'm sure I'm going to go over time. This is another type of phylogenetic tree. As you can see, it's all going to a common root. And what this is showing is the sequences of a type of transposon called BOV-B. And what these researchers did is they sequenced all of the BOV-B transposons in all these different animals. And what they found out is that you might expect that the sequences would be more similar in animals that are more closely related. But they actually found tons of crazy surprises. So here's just one neat example. The BOV-B sequence in python is actually more similar to sheep and cows than it is to, say, horses, which are over here closer to platypus and zebrafish. So these, what they think happened is that insect vectors like ticks have been biting different animals and taking pieces of these transposons with them, and they're getting inserted in different animals throughout the animal kingdom. So yeah, as you can see, the food that we think is natural, there's a lot going on, both the natural processes as well as the things that we're doing to it. And then we're adding genetic engineering on top. So how does this work? I'm actually going to talk about genetic engineering now that I've given all that background. So there's 2 primary methods. There's some newer technologies that are coming out, but these are the 2 main ones. First one I'm going to talk about here is this particle gun method. And so what you can do is actually take little pieces of gold, and you use pressure to shoot those little pieces of gold that have DNA coated on them into cells. And the DNA comes off and becomes integrated into the genome of those plant cells. So that's showing the integration of the DNA there. And so that's one method. And then the other method is called the agrobacterium method here. And what we're doing there is using a natural soil bacteria that's present. It's everywhere in the environment. And naturally, this bacteria causes these things called galls. I'm sure most of you have seen galls out in the environment. Did anybody know what caused those? No? Okay, so it's not just on leaves. There's also, if you see like a big lump on a tree or something like that, that's also caused by agrobacterium. And what it does is it infects the plant and inserts this piece of DNA into the plants and tells it, make a gall, make this tumor, and grow some food for me, and then the bacteria can live there happily. So what scientists have done is taken out that tumor-causing part and put in whatever the gene is that we want, and then you just grow the cells with the bacteria. The bacteria naturally do their thing, and you end up with the genes where you want them, and you can grow up the plants, and there you go. That's genetic engineering. So I'm sure everyone's thinking about safety. Okay, this technology, maybe it's not so scary, but is it safe? It's still different from what's going on in nature, even though it's similar. So I thought this was a really interesting study. This was conducted by the European Food Safety Organization, and they did a big study and looked at what research have they done on GMOs over the past 10 years. And this came out in 2010, so there's actually been even more research since then. And they found that 130 research projects covering more than 25 years of research and more than 500 independent research groups. And their conclusion was that GMOs are not more risky than conventional plant breeding. And this statement is echoed by many professional organizations of scientists all over the world. So just 3 examples are World Health Organization, American Medical Association, and National Academies of Sciences. And actually, the National Academy right now is doing a big study on GMOs. So if you go onto their website, you can find out more about that. They're doing some really great stuff. So still, even though we have all this research, tons of independent science that shows it's a safe technology, we still want to check, right? It's still prudent to double check to make sure that each individual example of a biotech trait in a plant species is safe. So in the United States, we have this thing called the Coordinated Framework for Regulation of Biotechnology. And there are many, many organizations that have to take a look at different things, but the primary ones are FDA, which is checking food safety, EPA, which is making sure that pesticides are used safely, and USDA, which is making sure that the plants are safe for agriculture and the environment. Of course, the most important one, at least for food safety purposes, is what the FDA is doing. So every single genetically engineered food that we have out in the marketplace today has been thoroughly examined by the FDA and found to be just as safe as conventionally produced foods. Okay, so we've talked about what is genetic engineering and how it's similar to things that are in the environment. But who cares? What can genetic engineering actually accomplish for us? And this goes back to this interest in environmentalism and making sure that food is safe and things like that. Well, there's consumer-oriented traits. Genetic engineering can do fun things like change colors and flavors. It can also do really important things like remove allergens. So for example, there is actually, it's not on the market yet, but scientists have developed a non-allergenic peanut. So if that became widespread, it could mean a lot of less people would have allergic reactions to peanuts and kids could start bringing peanut butter and jelly to school again. So that would be pretty cool if it made it out into the marketplace. There's also nutritional qualities. You could add nutrients, you could remove anti-nutrients, and you can reduce toxins. There's many possibilities there. Pest resistance. If you can make the plant naturally pest resistant through genetic engineering, then potentially you have to use less pesticides. There's stress tolerance, especially with the changing world around us. Making things that are drought tolerant or flood tolerant. With irrigation, you've seen more soils that have become more salty, so salt tolerant plants would be great. Some of you may have heard of arsenic in rice. That's kind of a little scary, especially when we're being told to feed our babies rice cereal. You could easily genetically engineer rice that doesn't take up arsenic from the soil. Just a couple things genetic engineering could do. And then, of course, there's those environmental characteristics for agronomic purposes. You could use less fertilizer if you could get the plants to fix nitrogen from the air, and then herbicide tolerance helps farmers to use different farming methods. So those are all the possibilities, but what's actually on the market today? This is often a question that people have. So how am I doing on time? I'm good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go through this list just so that everybody's really clear on it. So we have herbicide-tolerant alfalfa. That's generally used for feed for dairy cattle. So we're not going to find that in the grocery stores, but if you drink milk, then you are sort of drinking a product of herbicide-tolerant alfalfa. We have herbicide-tolerant canola, which is made into oil, although remaining in the oil, there's very little DNA or protein, so whether it's actually different from non-genetically engineered canola is debatable. Then we have herbicide-tolerant or insect-resistant field corn, which of course is turned into everything. So you're probably having genetically engineered corn. And I just wanted to emphasize something about this insect-resistant field corn really quick. So this picture is showing, this is the BT insect-resistant corn, and this is non-insect resistant. And not all non-GMO corn looks like this, so I'm not trying to say that. But in a lot of situations, if it's too wet in the field, if you're not storing your corn carefully, like sometimes happens in developing countries where they don't have really nice silos and stuff like that, like we do, then this fungus called aspergillus can infect the corn and produce these really terrible mycotoxins that can cause cancer, it can cause spontaneous abortions in pregnant women, it can cause brain damage, like it's really, really nasty stuff. So it's been shown through research that this insect-resistant corn actually has less of those toxins. Again, it's not really a big deal in the United States. There's some aflatoxin problems, but not so much. But in the developing world, this is a game changer. There's a little bit of herbicide-tolerant or insect-resistant sweet corn, not a lot. And popcorn, they haven't really genetically engineered that yet. Then there's herbicide-tolerant or insect-resistant cotton, which generally we're not eating cotton, but cottonseed oil is around. And then, of course, for fiber and livestock feed. And then we get into one that's kind of interesting, I think, which is virus-resistant papaya. So interesting that we decided to make Lanaquila papaya to tell that story. And I'm not going to go into a ton of the details here, but this is a picture of non-virus resistant papaya, and then this is the virus-resistant trees. And in Hawaii, about 20 years ago, the whole island pretty much got infected with this virus, which is moved around from plant to plant by an insect. And you can spray tons and tons of pesticides and things like that, but eventually all the trees get infected. And basically all the farmers were going to lose their livelihoods. So a local Hawaiian researcher developed this virus-resistant trees and basically saved the papaya industry. But hardly anybody hears that story on the mainland because we don't get a lot of papaya shipped here, unfortunately. There's a little bit of virus-resistant crookneck squash, and then there's herbicide-tolerant or insect-resistant soybean, but not the soybeans that we use for tofu or edamame, so you're not really eating that. It's mostly going for oil or livestock feed. And then last but not least, we've got herbicide-tolerant sugar beets, which is used, of course, for sugar, and then also fed to livestock. There's also two traits that have just recently been approved by the USDA. I think they've maybe both been approved by FDA, but they're not in the market yet. I don't remember if they've been approved by FDA yet or not. But so we've got potatoes that have been developed to not brown when cut or when they've been bruised. So they have that trait, and then the apples also are non-browning. And so what's really cool about this trait is that you can still tell if the potatoes or apples are rotting. It doesn't affect that. That's a different process. But if you slice up apples for your kids in advance, or you want to cut up the potatoes a day in advance for Thanksgiving or whatever, they're not going to get all gross just because they've used genetic engineering to silence one gene. So you're just turning something off, this browning process, and away we go. So that concludes my talk. We talked about how most food that we eat is actually pretty unnatural, and genes move around in nature all the time. Genetic engineering is pretty similar to lots of natural processes. And, of course, GMOs are extensively tested and regulated. But I think it's important to consider that We have to look at GMOs trait by trait and not just say all GMOs are good or all GMOs are bad, because each of them has different pros and cons. And then lastly, if you would like to connect with me, please feel free to follow me on Twitter, or Frankenfood has his own Twitter account. Or you can find us on Facebook if you search for BioFortified or I'm Genetic Maze.